Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Eric Kaufmann, a professor, distinguished author, and CSPI fellow. Eric, how are you doing today?
Good, Richard. It's good to be back, and always pleased to see CSPI doing so well.
Yes, I think you. This might be your fourth appearance. I think you're the record holder for most podcasts. So yeah, thanks for you're obviously a big part of that. And we're here to talk about your new report called "Diverse and Divided: A Political Dem- Demography of American Elite Students." And so, tell us about the survey. How did it come about? How did you collect the data, and what were you trying to find out?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just sort of noticing. I know some of the statisticians at Fire, and they do this survey every year, and it's got a lot of undergraduates on it. It's got something like 30 to 40,000 students a year. So after a couple of years, that was sort of almost um, 60,000 surveys. And I thought, well, this can tell us a lot about, because there's only really about 4 years, 18 to 21 maybe is the age range. So it can tell us a lot about young people. And it's a pretty unparalleled data source for that. So I kind of said, well, let's look at what this tells us about the U.S. student population and their politics. And so that's what sort of interested me initially.
hmm And what's the main takeaway? I think before I read this report, I would have thought probably they're all just going to be leftist, and there's going to be a sort of some of the demographic stuff is predictable, and I would have thought it just sort of different degrees of leftism. I would have actually been surprised if there were that many majority conservative universities in the country, but it was more conservative than I thought. Is that how you reacted to the data too?
Well, not so much. Well, it depends what way you're looking at it. I mean, I guess if your stereotype was that undergraduates at the elite 15%, so this is mainly students in the R1, it's sort of the top 15% of universities. So if your perception was they're all basically liberals, then yes, I mean, there is a sort of 22%, 23% conservative group and similar share of Republicans amongst these elite students. So yes, I guess that's one thing. But also more than that, I guess, is the fact they're not monolithic, but more than that, they're actually more divided, arguably, by identity than the greater U.S. electorate. And that's sort of the big finding is that if this is the future elite of the country, we're going to see big splits probably going forward.
Maybe, yeah, you're right. But still, I mean, it's the white males. The white males are liberal in the aggregate. So you will see, there's a division where it's like 100% of the minority elite will be liberal, and maybe like 70%. So maybe it's, I mean, maybe it's the future is a united elite, because there are, I don't think there are many demographics. You can narrow down white Christian. That's true. White Christian heterosexual male. That's not tons and tons of people, right? That's just and they're not completely conservative. So could the lesson be also that just it's going to be a united elite that's very liberal, even though there's demographic differences?
Well, I think if you look at the current elite, if you look at sort of the current electorate in the U.S., they are not as divided by religion, sexuality, race, and gender as these students are in their politics. And so my starting point, I suppose, would be to say this elite looks like it's going to be more, not less divided. I mean, and the reason for that is that divisions around identity I see as being stickier than divisions around socioeconomics. And if you look at financial aid, status, class, these sorts of things have almost no predictive power amongst these students in terms of their politics, whereas it's all identity. Whereas if you take the wider U.S. public sample, the economic stuff matters more than it does for the students, and the identity stuff is less powerful for predicting political beliefs. So kind of the picture that emerges here is that these divisions are probably going to be stickier, and people are find it harder to compromise on, politics that's tied to identity than politics that's tied to arguably to class or income. So I guess the prognosis from that would be there's maybe going to be less willingness to negotiate and accommodate than there is currently. Now that's not So that doesn't point in a rosy direction.
So you are so figure 14, for example, you have proportion Republican identifiers by subgroup, white Christians all 48%. Okay, so that that group is pretty evenly divided. All white males only 36%. So this is
Well,
taking
I should
um,
say that that doesn't include, so there is a significant independent group, right? So
right.
just because it's 48, if it's 48% Republican for, I think it was white Christian males, probably it's 30 something percent Democrat. It's not
Oh,
50.
that's the proportion. That proportion
Yeah.
also
So
includes independents.
so
Okay.
those are solidly more right leaning than left
Yeah.
leaning. So amongst students in elite universities, white males who identify as Christian, that's not, sorry, I should say that's have a Christian affiliation. In other words, you are not ticking the I have no religion box. That's all it is. So these are relatively nominal, or at best, they may be mainline. This is not evangelical. This is just anyone who doesn't go for the non-religion box or other religion.
And how many? How many? So yes, I have white male Christian 55 Republican, and then white Christian all, which I guess includes women, is 48. Um, the how many do you remember approximately how many whites identify as Christian versus something else or no
It's
religion?
something like, I mean, in the entire data set, it's a slight preponderance Christian over non-religious. It's something like 45-38 or something, something like
Okay.
that. So there's still more Christians than non-religious in the R1 schools by a few percentage points. So pretty evenly sized groups. But what's striking is that amongst that white group that identifies as Christian as opposed to non-religious, so a pretty mild kind of identification, they are actually more Republican and right-leaning amongst the student body. And actually, when we compare to the public, the general American population, white males, white male Christians, they look pretty similar to the general population in their politics. Whereas if you are a minority female, LGBTQ, etc., then that is, there are almost no Republicans in those groups.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is all conflated because how you identify and the religion, and the politics are so intertwined. So, like, you could say you're a Christian, you could be a cultural Christian. It doesn't really necessarily mean you are much of a believer. And then people who do that, I think, are more likely to be Republicans. You've written about LGBT and how sort of malleable that is. Race is also, pretty malleable. People can, claim identities based on some
Mm-hmm.
distant ancestor. Um, and so, is college just sort of, it's like flattening all these things. It's like, okay, if you're in this tribe, you're trying to be as least white and least straight as possible and least Christian as possible. And if you're in this tribe, you sort of go in the other direction, and all that stuff is gonna show up in the data. Like, oh, white Christian predicts conservative, where it's all just like one big thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it is interesting, though, to contrast this with the data from the general public in this CCES or ANES surveys, where it just seems like in these elite college environments, the environment seems to heighten the connection between identity and politics. Like that's there in the general public as well, but it just seems to be accentuated in the young elite environments like this. So for a good example would be, especially if we take minority or female young people in the general population, and then you take minority and female elite students, the share of conservatives amongst women and minorities is not that low in the general population and even the general young population, but it really tanks amongst elite students. So the really underrepresented groups are, minority conservatives and female conservatives. Those are the groups. Like if you were really doing DEI for real, you'd probably be targeting those groups because they just don't, they somehow vaporize before they set foot on campus.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, I mean, okay, if you're a woman and you're conservative, I mean, a lot of conservative women get married and have children pretty early. I mean, there's some religious communities where it's a lot earlier than us sort of urban educated people would suspect. So you do have, I mean, you do have that. You do have sort of the the cleavage off before they get to college. Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, is it that like college heightens these, or is it just like being intelligent, educated, paying attention to what's going on. They're just getting the signals from there's just elite signals that basically all minorities and all women have to be, left wing, and conversely, white men tend to be more right wing, right? It seems like it's just like I wouldn't be surprised if this was like if you just looked at like higher. Yeah, well, I know this is true that the higher, more education, more educated, more income you have, the more you tend to sort of have ideologically consistent views. You tend to be like down the line
Right.
conservative,
Yeah. That's
down the kind liberal. And it's not about being in college. I mean, this is even people who are, older and haven't been to college in a while. So it seems like there's just these sort of, these divisions, they become, yeah, well, let me ask you this. How much do you think these divisions are sort of socially constructed? They're just like, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where you tell people blacks are like this and women are like this and Hispanics are like that, or how much of it is just sort of like natural? Like in men and women, you might say they see the world differently. They have different experiences. Could be true for races. Do you have a sense of like just thoughts about like how much is each of these things going on?
Well, I think the social construction side, you're right, that we know from political science, there's a long literature that, better educated are more likely to sort, issues into ideologies, into parties. But I think this seems to have a really big effect on minorities in particular, because we know, particularly for African Americans, that there's very low sorting and low polarization in general. But maybe on the college campus, that equation comes, the equation is being made by other people. So I kind of would think a certain social construction effect is going on that's really hitting minorities, particularly African Americans who come to university. And then for women, maybe too, perhaps, that their sort of political socialization is just more intense. The expectations are more intense on campus. In terms of the evolutionary side, I think if that were true, we would see it, I guess, also in the non-university population, or in the groups that are going to lower ranked colleges, but we don't see it as much. It really seems like it's more intense in the elite college environment. So I think there is, at the very least, social environment, I think, is playing a role, in perhaps in interaction with certain psychological predispositions like high openness, maybe. But that's really producing a female and minority student population that looks quite different from their counterparts in the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, just going back to sort of my, impression from reading this, it's more, I mean, there are more, Republicans almost everywhere than I would have thought. So you have this proportion, going back to that figure 12, it's like all students, and these are elite students, right? R1, R2, or just R1?
It's sort of 75% R1 and most of the rest R2.
Okay, and then you have Ivy Leagues, and you have these liberal arts colleges, right? So you have the the top few percent of college students, or top what percentage of it does this cover of
It's
college
about
students?
15%, I would say. Top 15, heavily weighted.
And then you have so all from all students, you have 23% Republican, 55% Democrat, and the rest are independent. According to this, I mean, there's two things here. First of all, this is the Trump era. When I think that the proportion identifying as Republican has to be, at its lowest point. I think any other Republican who's the most famous Republican in the country is probably going to appeal more to people who are college educated. I think who the like leader of each party is actually plays an outsized role in the public imagination. The other thing is, I mean, there's also the and this, you did the LGBT study, and you saw that the gay people who identify as gay are probably much more likely to fill out surveys. What I've done recently written about Democrats and liberals being more likely to answer polling in the context of
Mm.
presidential elections. So there's got to be. I mean, there's no reason to think that something like that is not going on here too, right? I mean, when you find these data where like in these schools like 50% are LGBT, it's probably not that high. I mean, just based on what else we know. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think that is right. It's very difficult to know how big the inflation is on LGBT. Of course, as with comparing census data in Canada and Britain, the inflation could be as high as 3 times, but I don't know. I'm not sure is the answer, because there are some people who argue, well, the census undercounts it. I don't know if that's true. But it is just interesting, though, that this identity category is now a major player. Like, it's a major factor. Whereas, like, if you went back to the 1970s, all the students would or heavily be Christian, largely white, more male, very few LGBT. I mean, it's a completely different world in a way. Whereas now, these major building blocks are they're big. The LGBT, the no religion block. Those are now significant constituencies on campus and are shaping politics. Now, whether I my belief would be that would decline substantially. I mean, the LGBT share will decline substantially as people get older and settle down and whatever. But I still think that is going to be somewhat more important in the population and in voting than it has been. The other thing I should say, by the way, is we have some overtime data I gleaned from the Higher Education Research Institute, which has sort of got its freshman survey of, like, I think 100,000 running since 1970. You can see this gender gap emerging. Yes, the students have been trending liberal since sort of the early mid 2000s, but it's really on the back of women who are now sort of 14 points more liberal than they were in the early 2000s. I'm not sure this is really due to individual presidents, right? I mean, there have been multiple presidents since. There's been the Obama era, there was the Bush era, there's the Trump era, and I should also say, like in Britain, the young people are also really liberal, with a whole succession of leaders. So I'm less convinced that it's Trump. I actually think this is something a lot deeper than Trump.
Oh, I do too. I would just be surprised if Trump is not suppressing the Republican numbers by 5 or 10%. I mean, I would be surprised if he couldn't have at least an effect of that magnitude. Do you disagree with that?
I don't think that's right. I think whoever they get next, I wouldn't expect these numbers to shift a whole ton. I don't. Yeah, I don't think it's Trump.
Yeah. Well, so in the 2012 election, I mean, so Romney won college-educated whites, and Trump lost them by a lot. So we saw just in 4 years. I mean, the having a different nominee could just switch a large portion of educated voters. So why couldn't that also happen if it's Romney again or somebody like Romney next time?
Yeah, it could. I mean, Romney won college-educated whites. I think Trump was very close. I think it might have been 50-50. I don't know if he lost them. It's
Yeah, well, it was
pretty close.
I think it depends on the polls you look at. The polls
Yeah,
running up to the elections, but whatever. There's probably some delta there. There's some significant delta between Romney
yeah, I
and
think
Trump.
there's some scope there. I mean, I guess the question is whether the younger elite students are more politically perhaps set in their ways, perhaps if this is about a kind of political prejudice. The fire surveys also show that only 12% of non-Republican students would date a Trump supporter, right? So I think you've kind of got there's pretty strong political bias or pretty political prejudice there, and that might actually withstand a change of leader, especially if it's someone like a DeSantis. I'm not sure it would change much.
Yeah, I disagree. I think there's something unique about. I think there's something
Yeah.
uniquely aesthetically about Trump that draws certain people to him, and that alienates and really draws people the other direction. I think he's different, and I think DeSantis. I think DeSantis would be the reality would be closer to Romney. I don't think it's as much about like moderate or non-moderate politics. I think it's just like normal human being versus Trump. I just think he's in his own category. I think anyone else would be sort of closer to Romney and how the public would react. But anyways, this is for the future of politics. I was looking at not that long ago the federal judges, and in our system, judges is one of the most important things that a president does. And like they were looking at breaking down the demographics. I mean, it's amazing. The Democrats, I mean, like white males are a minority. I mean, the number of the blacks among the judges appointed by Biden. It's like 20%. I mean, just like the Hispanic numbers. I mean,
Really?
they're really really high. I mean, much higher than number of blacks who graduate from elite colleges or anything you would expect. It's really there's massive diversity, appointmentship in the federal, if that's a word, in the federal judiciary. And then people look at Trump. And the Republicans, and it's what you expect. It's almost exclusively white, a lot of white men, and so you're having like it's just fascinating. The right now there are three liberals on the Supreme Court, and every one of them is a woman. You have no male liberals on the Supreme Court, which is I mean it's not people don't talk about that enough, but you have you have Sotomayor, you have Kagan, and then you have Ketanji Brown Jackson. And then on the conservative side, you have six, and you have five men and one woman. And it's funny. There's so much racial diversity on the liberal side. There's three women, each is of a different race. One is Puerto Rican, one is Jewish, and one is black. Right. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's interesting.
so the entire federal judiciary is becoming basically going in this direction. And from what your research indicates and everything we know indicates that it's going to keep going like this. It's going to be like all judges are going to be white men. In politics, there'll be more like affirmative action. You'll have like Republicans nominating, just I don't know, like politics. It's like you vet your judges usually much more than your politicians, and the politicians can just go and they don't even have to be very smart or anything. You can just get anybody to be a politician, and the parties I think will seek out some diversity. Democrats will probably give some boost to white men who are more electable, and Republicans will do the affirmative action thing and have a lot of more blacks and women than you'd expect. But in the world of bureaucracy and the world of like courts, I think we're going to a very, very polarized place. And I don't know. It's just I don't know how it's going to play out. It's just going to be a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting because you're right that if you take that top education level, it does seem as though we're producing a more identity divided, you know, identity polarized elite in the sense that minorities and women are disproportionately in the elite, disproportionately leaning left, and white Christian male are looking like the rest of the population. So that's a growing divide. I guess the only counter to that would be, I mean, I don't know if you saw that statistic that I think if you come out of the Ivy League and you're a law grad, your chance of clerking is something like 12 or 14 times higher, or maybe it's 12 times higher if you are conservative. And so I think what's happening there is because of the influence, conservatives through the Federalist Society are mining their small seam of talent more intensively. And so, presumably, if they wanted to just get the Clarence Thomases, and if they wanted some diversity, they could mine an even smaller seam to produce that. But you're right. In the general scheme of things, they would probably wind up with more white Christian males.
Oh, I don't. Yeah, I don't think
Males.
there's many Clarence Thomases. I mean, I don't think there's many at the lower levels. It's you're right because there's an equal number of like conservative and liberal judges approximately, but like there's a lot more at elite universities. There's a lot more liberal students, etc. So just by necessity, conservatives are going to get a kind of affirmative action. They're going to be more likely. But I know people have been in Yale Federalist Society and they don't talk about like all these blacks that are participating in Yale FedSoc. I mean they're just not there. I mean I think that if you
Right.
can if you want to just somebody wanted to be a careerist as much as possible, I think being a minority, being a woman, and going into like conservative politics, like I think that's the best path for you. I mean that's probably the easiest path to success. But it doesn't seem like a lot of people are inclined to take that path, especially at elite universities. The socialization and the pressures. I mean, look at what Clarence Thomas, how he talks about the pressures that he faced. I mean, it's just too great for most people.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether they might recruit at lower ranked universities or regional or maybe even historically black colleges or some other source, right? I mean, that would
Well, I
probably
think
be the strategy
HBCUs. I think probably. Yeah,
if
I
you
think the
wanted to
last
have.
place you'd find them were HBCUs,
Yeah,
conservatives,
yeah.
honestly.
But I mean, here, of course, we've got the Conservative Party who's doing badly now, but they've got a lot of minorities at the front, in the top positions, which they've kind of done, I think, by recruiting heavily from from minority conservative students. So I think if you want to do it, there are ways to do it. But it depends on. They'll probably have to go away from the Ivy League. I'm guessing they'd have to go
Well,
out.
I mean, Amy Coney Barrett, where did she go to law school? She was I know she was teaching at Notre Dame. She got her JD, I believe. I want to say also from Notre Dame, right? So yeah, that's it's still a good law school, but it's a little bit down. They have this woman, and she's got this great story with all these kids and these conservative views. So yeah, they did do a little bit of that. While the liberals are still appointing just everyone from Harvard and Yale. Because liberal conservatives do that too, but like I think the Amy Coney Barrett is an interesting counterexample of that. Yeah, there are, they're just, I mean, there just aren't a lot of black. So you have conservatives are a minority of students. Blacks are, 90 something percent, more polarized than the general publication. And Democrats, Clarence Thomas was like a unicorn. Just statistically, you're not, who goes to an elite school, you're just not going to find. I mean, if you find one person like that a generation, they'll put him on the Supreme Court. They would be happy to put another Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. They're just not out there. So yeah, if you're a young, black law student, there's a path available for you. The other thing with the UK, I mean, it's interesting because I think that the UK, the education polarization does not strike me as so extreme, and the racial polarization does not strike me as extreme, right? So is that right? In which case,
Well,
it probably would be easier to
it's
recruit.
not as extreme. Yeah, I think that's right. And so one of the things you notice is that in the black conservatives tend to be of an African background, African immigrant background, or let's say second generation, whereas the Caribbean blacks tend to be in the Labor Party and on the left. So that's kind of a
Interesting divide.
split. Yeah. And then similarly with the South Asians, the Pakistanis, and the more Muslim groups tend to be on the left, and the Hindus and Sikhs are more on the right. So there is a certain sorting by ethnicity. I mean, it's not to say all the Hindus and Sikhs are on the right. They're probably split evenly, whereas Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are probably heavily on the left.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So in our country, we do not have, I mean, a lot of immigrant blacks involved in. Well, because you don't have any native blacks, so I mean, they're going to be immigrants. Yeah, there was this one woman called Mia Love, who was like I think a Mormon convert. Her background was from Haiti. She was I think she lost her reelection, but she did serve as a congresswoman as a Republican.
Right.
And then yeah, I mean Colin Powell had a Caribbean background, and then so did Eric Holder. On the other
Right.
side, I don't think they were born there, but their families came from there. And so, yeah, in America, we don't even think of them as like immigrants. We just see blacks assimilating. We just see them as black people, and we see them as assimilating into the larger population. The Caribbean. I mean, the Caribbean. I guess they have the history of colonization. I don't know if that's part of it, the Africans, are
Yeah.
something else. But I mean, I would be interested to see more Africans. I mean, we have Obama, obviously, whose dad was from
Right.
East Africa. And then, like Ilhan Omar. So there's not a lot of conservatives that I could think of that come from African backgrounds, but it would be interesting if such people started
Yeah,
running into a lot of our politics.
because one of the sort of the most populist anti-woke kind of tough on the border candidates here was someone called Kemi Badenoch, who was a Nigerian immigrant background, who ran for and actually topped it was the top choice of the members, although the members of parliament got to winnow it down to the final two, so they didn't include her. But it's just, yeah, I think there is, I don't know, I mean, in a way, even a really, really small percentage of a really large number is still quite a few people. So, I mean, if you had an efficient selecting mechanisms, they're probably I'm just thinking of, it's like the black conservatives on Twitter, or let's say the dissidents like Coleman Hughes and McWhorter and Wilfred Riley and people like that. There must be those people as well coming out of law school, but you have to be able to identify them.
Yeah, I don't think they exist. I mean, if you look at the top elite schools, I mean, Yale has a few hundred graduates. Maybe 10% are black. Maybe one is probably going to be conservative a year. I mean, so like,
Yeah,
yeah, you have
that's
like
true.
one more from Harvard and one more for Stanford, and who knows what they want to do with their lives if they won't even want to be judges or whatever. So yeah, I would be. Yeah, I mean, maybe Hispanics, maybe you'll have more luck there. I think Hispanics, there's not as much affirmative action being practiced. So I think if you see more Hispanics coming into elite universities, maybe that would probably be a more useful place to search. But yeah, and then the women thing. I mean, I really do think the conservatives are handicapped here by the fact that a lot of women do get married and have children and are not the most, necessarily willing to throw, forget everything else and just focus on career. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett was able to do it, right? And she had, 7 kids and a few of them were adopted. But that's just not I think, that most people can't do that.
No,
And so, yeah. And so, what can you do there? I think,
superhuman, I think, but
yeah, right. So I think you have to, I don't know. Like, what do you think? What do you think? Like, I think the liberal, this doesn't pose difficulties for liberals. They look at data like this, they can say, oh, we'll just say, diversity is good and we're the party of diversity and we're the compassionate people who take into account the feelings and interests of, all groups. What's the conservative answer? I mean, do you just recruit affirmative action and try to downplay, or do you embrace it? Do you embrace it to a certain extent? Have you thought about this?
well, I don't. I think. I mean, there's some degree to which you can do affirmative action, but I think there's also a danger in essentially playing them at their own game, because you're affirming that view of the world that essentially more diversity is always to the good. Whereas I think probably the sensible thing is to do some diversity. No doubt there will be a disproportionate number of women or non-whites compared to the pipeline. But on the other hand, you don't want to. You also want to have your most talent. Whoever the most talented person is in the job as well. So you kind of have to balance those two. Um, yeah, I don't know what the liberal side is, what their thoughts are on something like judges. Are they going to go for just maximal diversity to the point where there are no white men at all in their uh, nominees? I don't know. I mean, that would seem to be a strategy that I don't think will play that well. The optics of that may not play that well, even for minorities, particularly Latinos, for example. I'm not sure they're going to, but I don't know.
Yeah, from people I talk to who are involved in high level judicial politics, like there's actually I think that some people think of judicial appointments like you just want in our system where the judges are so important, you just want the judges to rule in the right way, right? So competence is really maybe not that important, but the people tell me is that like being smart, like being the best person, actually does matter because there's a lot of strategy in like which arguments you notice, what has effect, like which cases you decide to take and which cases you decide to pass on. So yeah, I think this kind of affirmative action the Democrats are undertaking. I think it's got to be self defeating in the end. Um, the Yeah, but I guess my question was how do like okay, so yeah, so conservatives do a little bit maybe of preferences, but then they really don't, and they just all end up being a bunch of white men. I mean, the question is like, can they avoid like what are they? What's the response though when like is there like a sort of a party line? Unlike the response to when liberals say, "Oh, this is wrong. There's something bad about you. You're just trying to bring more privilege to those who are already privileged." I mean, is there a political way to sort of answer this?
Well, my view on this is that I would just say, well, the privilege or no privilege is not the highest value. The highest value has to be competence. Stick to the meritocratic line that we'll take it into account where there's a tie break. We'll use
But
we'll
also
use
they'll
it.
say, why are you 95% white men if competence? Are you saying that white men are more competent than other people?
Well, I mean, you have to look at your pipeline of, you just say, well, what's our pipeline like? We're reflecting our pipeline. So I don't know who knows what the actual selection will be. I presume it should reflect the pipeline. Whatever demographics are in the pipeline is what's going to wind up.
Well, yeah, but then you'll say, okay, why does your ideology only appeal to these to these bad people? You see, there has to be, I think there has to be an answer. I think there has to be something beyond,
Well, it
oh,
doesn't only appeal, though, does it? I mean, it's going to be, yes, it'll be less diverse than the Democrat pipeline, but
mm.
it's not the fault of the ideology that it attracts certain groups more than other
Well,
groups. I mean, you
they'll
can
say it is
certainly
the fault.
point. Well, you can
They'll
certainly
say,
point to the wider voting
mm.
public. like if that's the concern, you can just say, well, this may be an artifact of the elite pipeline. But if we look at the wider population, very clearly there are a lot of, particularly Hispanic and Asian people voting for the Republicans. It's not really a problem at the mass level, but maybe the particularities of the elite game mean that there's a certain stereotyping that goes on and that tends to push minorities into the left column. Maybe what you could say is that culture is socially constructing minorities into the liberal column. So maybe that's where you're saying, well, this shouldn't be happening. We should actually be trying to move away from political typing of minorities and just take people more on as individuals, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Doesn't have a obvious answer. I would embrace being the male party. I would embrace it, and I would say our women, we have women on our side, but they often want to get married and have children. That is a legitimate lifestyle choice, and you are discriminating and denigrating them by saying that they have to be equally represented as men and saying that their lives are less valuable or they're contributing less to society. I would take a little bit maybe more of a aggressive role on this.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think this idea of discrimination, right? That essentially gender or racial discrimination is something we're against. I mean, I think that's a useful way to proceed, right? Because if you are essentially selecting for race and gender, then that is a form of discrimination. So yeah, I think that's probably a strong card to play. I don't know. Leaning into we are a male party, I'm not sure that's a great idea. I mean, the other thing is, of course,
male and women who like men and who like heteronormative relations.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think though the evidence. So one of the there's different bits of evidence. I mean, one is there's a huge divide politically between particularly stay-at-home mums, who trend much more heavily Republican. But also the fact, I think that whether you are a Republican or Democrat is heavily determined also by psychology, and so there's, even amongst career women, you're going to have probably a certain proportion that are leaning right. Even amongst the most unlikely demographics. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd go with typing by gender, but I'd say definitely saying that we don't do discrimination on the basis of race and sex. I think that's probably the best answer.
Yeah, right. And then, in politics, I mean, electoral politics, I think is fine. But although it can, because it's like, politicians aren't necessarily, they're supposed to they are supposed to represent the people, right? They are like,
Yeah, yeah,
like the people. They don't, but I think it's gotten disastrous. I think with Georgia, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the race in Georgia, but this guy, Herschel Walker, this
Herschel Walker, yeah.
who Trump loves and who's had, multiple abortions and multiple children out of wedlock and multiple mental issues. Yeah, he's
it seems like a car crash.
He still might win. I mean, it's not hopeless.
Really? Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah, he still might win, but yeah, you could see the when you're selecting from a small pool and you're desperate for Black Republicans. I think this often happens. You just don't have anybody of quality you could point to. So the most right leaning student bodies, you have this other figure. It's number 28. How many do you? It looks like there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 schools where more Republicans than Democrats. Is that every school with more?
That's pretty much it. It's pretty much around a dozen out of 160 or so. So yeah. I mean, this is the other part of the report. Of course, is it's also a rankings system of viewpoint diversity, and what I mean by that is an even number of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats gets you the top score. And University of Arkansas, I think, got top spot as the most viewpoint diverse, compiled out of the 2020-2021 data. So, and what you kind of see is that, it's really those red state, deep red flagship universities where you have the most even mix. A lot of them will have a significant number of liberals. I mean, a Brigham Young University, people think these are all conservative. Not at all. I mean, even a BYU, I think, has got 30-something% liberal and 48% conservative. But in many of those red state schools, it's pretty even. And of course, the point there is, and this is something that I don't address as much in this report, but I have looked at the data, is that essentially the fear of speaking your mind and the degree to which you self-censor is very tied to the mix, the ideological mix. So the more viewpoint diversity, the freer the conversation. And so actually, one of the points I make also in my Unheard piece is that, where people fled the interior for the coastal cities to find that intellectual freedom, it's almost a century later. It looks like that's almost turning around, where people are almost going to have to flee the sort of liberal arts colleges and Ivy Leagues, East Coast schools or West Coast schools for the heartland in order to find that freer intellectual climate. And so that was one of the ironies.
Yeah, I mean, Hillsdale is like something, you have all these interior schools, but then Hillsdale is something completely different. It's an outlier. It's 76% conservative, 11 liberal. The second place is Utah State at 49 conservative and 30 liberal. So everything is just like 2 to 1 is like the most, and it's not even 2 to 1. It's like, 50% more conservatives than liberals is the most you could expect. And then Hillsdale, you have, 6 or 7 times more conservatives than liberals. And it's very interesting. I mean, they had a strategy of they do not take federal funding, so they don't have to comply with civil rights law. So they are very they are a very explicitly conservative place, and I don't think it's even. I don't think it's even. It's not like Liberty University. It's not tied to like evangel. Maybe it is a Christian school. I'm not sure, but I don't think it's even. If religion, I don't know if religion is central to its identity. Let me look this up.
But the student body is heavily Christian, but
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
not sure it's not some kind of a requirement. And so, yeah, it seems that, but it's definitely an outlier. There's no question about it. In its makeup is completely, off the scale compared to every other college. Now, however, having said that, of course, the liberal arts colleges are less politically diverse than Hillsdale. Hillsdale, I think, has about 11% liberal, if I can remember it correctly. And whereas the liberal arts colleges, it's sort of in the range 0 to 5% conservative for a lot of the ones like Smith and Wellesley and ones that are down at the ends there. So it's the sort of very left leaning schools are less politically diverse even than Hillsdale. But amongst the right leaning ones, Hillsdale's really off the charts.
Yeah,
Um,
and then and then the other right leaning ones are Utah State, Brigham Young, right, Mormon school, Wyoming. You have these Texas like technical schools, A&M and Texas Tech. People think of Texas as sort of a blueing state, but it's interesting that the young people still more conservative than liberals in college. It's not Austin, UT Austin, I'm sure. But then you have Wyoming, you have Kansas State University, you have Baylor, you have Clemson, you have University of Alabama. These are the conservative schools. Um, but it's interesting. I mean, I would not have, I don't know. I would have suspected that maybe no flagship university would have had more conservatives than liberals. I would have maybe Utah. I would have guessed, but not these other ones. So maybe the it's sort of like the people expect these like states to become more everything to be more liberal over time, and these states especially to become more democratic over time. Maybe that's not going to happen, right? Maybe Texas, if the educated public in Texas is still going to be majority conservative, that means Texas might be safe for the Republican column for a while. Do you think that sounds right?
Yeah, I think that does sound right. I mean, I think one thing that's occurring is, and because what I did was I looked at segregation. How much are conservatives or white Christians or these groups disproportionately concentrated in certain schools and not in other schools? And what you see is the sort of white conservative, in general, conservatives are more concentrated than liberals. Um, it would suggest that, and particularly white conservatives and white Christians, the pattern seems to be that if you had a really bright, white Christian kid from, let's say, Wyoming or from Texas or wherever, they may be less likely to head for the Ivy League or head for an East Coast or liberal arts college than a liberal. And so I think one of the things that's going on is that there is a certain degree to which these students are staying in state if they're from a red state. Um, and so, yeah, I think you might get that, uh, maintenance of these sorts of voting patterns, including amongst elites, because of this phenomenon. Um, and that's partly why I argue that in a way, whites, Christians, white conservatives are becoming. You could argue they're maybe becoming a somewhat more self-conscious group as they decline, as their numbers are much smaller than they used to be. Then that becomes a basis for a kind of identity politics, oddly. So
Well, yeah, I mean, some of these places, I don't know if they're are there a lot of like people who could go to the coast who don't? I mean, like University of Arkansas, for example. I don't think the average standardized test is very high. So part of it might be the liberal schools might just be getting everybody except Hillsdale and Mormons, like people who are self consciously conservative or self consciously Mormon. University of Wyoming. It's probably just these are probably just people who. Um, there might be some who could go to like better schools, but it seems like a lot of cases maybe not. So maybe that's
yeah, but all
the,
you need is
the brain drain.
a small difference, let's say, between the ones who could go to a better school, let's say out of state, or choose not to for whatever reason. I mean, if it's even a slight difference between a liberal kid from Wyoming and a conservative kid, then that's going to matter at the aggregate level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not always. Yeah, it's not like the most natural thing for someone to want to move around to wherever they can the best university they could get into. I think a lot of people are connected to home. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many. Like, I don't know how many people. These states like Wyoming and so forth. I mean, they were founded by people who left home and went and settled somewhere in like the middle of nowhere. So I don't know if they're necessarily the kind of people who would necessarily be attached to where they live. But some of them must be. There's this uh, there's this yeah. I mean, what do you think about I don't know. Like, what do you think? I'm gonna write something about this, and this might be out by the time we release this podcast. Do you have an idea of like sort of the roots of the culture wars, this sort of urban rural divide? Is it just? I think you put a lot of stock in ideas. Just there's this expressive ideology that elites have, and there's it bounces up against I think human nature to a certain extent. These people who just are socially conservative or ethnocentric to a certain degree. Is that how you see it, or do you think there's something deeper going on here that can sort of explain culture wars across sort of a similar culture war across developed countries?
Yeah, I think the core is the sort of Jonathan Haidt mechanism. Certain types of people like seeing messy dots on a screen, and other people want to see them in a neat triangle. His paper from 2018 with all those other psychologists. But that's obviously very correlated with that sort of disposition for kind of order and stability versus change and difference is, I think, at the core of politics. And I think that those sort of psychological dispositions then they lead people to select for those environments, which tend to be the more conservative environments. So you're getting, you start with a kind of evolved psychological difference that selects people into different environments, which accentuates those differences. That's the sort of pattern I think we're kind of in. Um, and so I do think that that's the starting block. Now, what happens is you get a different reaction to immigration. So, one of the big patterns has been this polarization around the immigration issue in the US, in Canada, in Britain. It's most extreme in the US and Canada from what I've seen of the data, but it's gone from like 10, 12 points in as 2012 to 50 points by 2016 in the US, and in Canada between 2013 and 2019, something similar. So, what I think you're getting is a sorting of the electorate based on that disposition. Now, of course, there is party queuing and messaging, but like in the Canadian case, the Conservative side has not been pushing an immigration restrictionist lines. So, but at the same time, if you look at the survey data, that's favored by a lot of Conservative voters. And so the sorting, I think, is going on, and I think it's based on psychology. Now, culture wars is a sort of liberal or left liberal reaction to that populist conservatism that wants less change, less difference, more order, and then the left side is moralizing that as you're closed-minded, you're deplorable, racist, etc. And then the sort of conservative side is then reacting against being called deplorable, or in the British case, we had various politicians who called, working class British people racists in a way, or implied that they were. So you have this kind of dynamic going back and forth. It's a second order moral conflict that's built on this first order psychological divide. So I see that as the dynamic that we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The height stuff used to be more convincing to me. Do you think people who want stability and predictability and order that you would vote for Donald Trump? Is that the way to get stability and order? It seems to be that there's it seems to be I hear liberals now when they're trust the experts. They seem to be most the most small c conservative, trust institutions. Whoever has a degree, whoever's expertise, who every government program, every they seem to be some of the most like conservative people I've ever seen. They don't distrust anything. I mean, they really believe in our institutions. So I don't know if that's psychological. That's the sort of psychological cleavage there.
Well, I guess you might be willing to vote for a disruptor if you think they will bring back, make America great again. What you're voting for is somebody who's going to bring back stability on a kind of identity level, let's say. So even though they are going against the system, if you kind of think the system is what is standing in the way of you having a more cohesive society that looks more like the past, then you will go with a disruptor. When we've seen this time and time again with populists in various contexts, by the way, including like, you know, sectarian politics in Northern Ireland, people voting for Ian Paisley, that kind of thing. Paisley was a disruptor, but on the other hand, hey, he's the one who's going to guarantee that we're not going to be in a united Ireland. So it is. I think it makes sense. Similarly with Brexit, like if you think about, hey, they're going to protect our identity, but to do that they have to disrupt the existing elite. And then on the other hand, on the other side, they want to stick with the existing elite because they will protect diversity and change and that dispensation.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that that theory is sort of it's unfalsifiable, right? You could say, oh, they want order, and then but then the other people they want a disruptor. Oh, they just want a different, they really secretly want order. So I don't know if like the order thing, explains it. The stability. I think there's something there related to race and gender, but I think it's like it's too abstract to say order. Like, so if you look at like economic policy, right? I mean, yeah, the populists, I mean, they're more left wing than traditional Republicans have been on economic policy, but still, I mean, the fact that the populists do not prioritize economic stability, right? They don't say, oh, we care, they're not being drawn to Trump for his trade policy or whatever. They don't care. They care about immigration. They care about PC. And so like that's the entire thing of economics. Like it's stability doesn't seem to explain anything about the right versus left, and then like foreign policy, I don't know that you can explain like stability is like anything to do with any of that. So it's just like it seems to me it's more narrow. It's just like these, it's race and it's gender and it's sexuality, and it's like it's not like stability or order because like we have a certain order now, right? And so like there's people who are defending it and people who want to radically upend it, and you could say they're going back to a different order, but then that's just like everything is just order, right? In that case, it's not doesn't
Well,
distinguish one side from the other.
yeah, I don't know. I think it depends. You're right. I mean, the thing about gender and race and these demographics is they give you really weak models of voting. I mean, that'll give you at the most maybe 10% of the
No,
variation
I
in.
mean, I mean, attitudes toward these things. I don't mean just,
Okay,
specifically just,
well, attitudes towards race and gender. Yeah, but
yeah, exactly.
I suppose to the extent that that sort of is really about some kind of continuity with the past, returning to a past dispensation. So the question, you just have to look at the huge, powerful correlations between a question like things in America were better in the past, or American culture was better in the past. I mean, that is just so much more powerful. many times more powerful than anything demographic in predicting a Trump vote, or predicting a Brexit vote, by the way. So that, I'm quite convinced by the strength of these correlations. That's what's at the core of this is things in America were better in the past. The end of story. Then there are other questions like, okay, support for death penalty, support for strict child rearing, the kind of authoritarianism literature. I mean, that's a reasonably good predictor. It's better than the demographics. It's not as good as the things. American culture was better in the past. I mean, that is far, far more important. So I just think there's this desire for, more of a continuity with the past and less, seeing difference as disorderly, seeing change as loss. Those core motivations, I think, and then you'll vote for whoever will get you that dispensation again.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I don't think, yeah, I don't think that's completely wrong. I think there's something there about the. I was looking at some breakthrough data, and they were like, "Oh, had the internet has been, bad for society." I'm like, "Oh, somebody could think the internet was bad for society," and it was like Brexit voters, like overwhelmingly, like, yes, the internet has been bad for society, and I was surprised that, like, somebody could actually think that. I mean, it has problems, but I mean, still, I mean, the benefits seem overwhelming to me.
Well,
Um,
the other thing I would say is like you can see on certain questions like on the pandemic stuff that is less important. It doesn't sort the electorate as well. So, for example, a lot of Brexit supporters supported all of the lockdown restrictions. They weren't necessarily anti-lockdown in a big way. Now, it was a little different in the U.S. and Canada, of course, but still, I don't think that's as powerful. It's not as powerful as the sort of things were better in the past. If we're trying to pick
Yeah,
out,
well, the lockdown. I mean, the thing is, I was looking. I also saw like the far right in Germany was also marching against the lockdown. So it does seem. I did see actually some data showing it showed across nationally, and it showed European country after European country, the right was generally against more restrictions. So there does seem to be a pattern there, and that's actually quite interesting too, because like with what would the stability and order, what would that predict, right? I think it would predict something like closer to China. I mean, I think that's a regime which just seems all about stability and order, and they just are scared to death of COVID, and just like let whatever happen, let it rip through the population, let it kill as many people as possible. We need our freedom, and we need to be able to live our lives. That seems to be like the anti-stability. Or how does the theory explain that? It's sort of it's an anomaly, isn't it?
it is an anomaly, and it's not explained by this theory at all. But that's one of the reasons I think that no populist party in Europe really has led with this issue. I mean, the whole lockdown vaccine thing has not been really front and center for any serious populist party in Europe. I mean, they've all led on the migration sort of issue. And so that's kind of an example of what I mean is that this isn't. Nigel Farage tried to do a bit on anti-lockdown stuff in Britain. It went nowhere. I think that's the dominant pattern, I would say. I don't, of course, to the extent if the right sort of talks it up, then some people will take a party cue and adopt that point of view. But I think it's a lot flimsier than the uh, identity stuff, and particularly the desire for less change. I think
So
that's
yeah,
sort of.
so I saw some pretty strenuous protests against lockdowns. I think in like Belgium or the Netherlands, some of these northern. I don't know if they were necessarily right coded. Maybe it was just all young people were just angry, and maybe they were cross ideological. Maybe it wasn't as maybe it wasn't like a right wing thing.
Yeah, yeah.
In
Well, like
America, it
Canada,
definitely
for
was.
that's that. Like in Canada, the trucker thing and there's a significant youth and young person element to support for conservatism now in Canada on the back of these being anti-lockdown. I think that's more of a libertarian. I think in a way that Canadian libertarian populist movement is a bit of an outlier and is not really similar to what we've seen on populist right parties elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, that's. I mean, that's. I mean, that is interesting. Yeah, I was watching Zamor speech, and I remember this was pretty. This was when was the French election? It was like late 2021 or early 2022. I think it was late 2021. I no, because
Yeah, I'm
I'm
trying
trying
to
to
remember
remember
the.
because
I think it was 2022, but yeah, it was
no,
definitely
it was
20.
2022 because I remember Philippe Lemon was telling me that the Russian invasion of Ukraine really screwed with Zamor's chances. So it must have been in 2022. Um, but in 2022 or 2021, I see a Zamor rally and they're all wearing masks outside. Maybe this was like during Christmas holiday, and like the idea that an American far right, I mean, right, even a right
Right.
rally, people would be wearing masks outside. I mean, like just unthinkable. So it really was it does seem like it was a completely different issue in Europe. Okay, I want people to be anti-lockdown.
Right.
To be open. So yeah, I wish it would motivate somebody, but yeah, maybe it's more optimistic if it's more. Well, I guess it's not optimistic if Europeans, all were willing to go along with it. I think that's a negative. But oh well, I go where the evidence leads. George Mason. Where's George Mason on this? So you have, I mean, it's really cool. I mean, you have at the end, you have this, and you have an interactive table that we link to on the website where the report is. And so I mean, it's just very cool to sort of look through this. Idaho, University of Idaho, more liberal than conservatives. George Mason, is interesting, right? So I saw the George Mason one. It's 27 conservative, 28 moderate, and 45 liberal. And George Mason. I mean, George Mason is the home of sort of intellectual libertarianism. Very interesting that it's the student body is left leaning. Maybe it's just Northern Virginia.
Yeah, although
That's something.
27 is actually reasonably high as a conservative share for a kind of DC based school. Obviously, it's a very racially diverse, university, which, so it's kind of, I would almost, compared to the Ivy Leagues, which are sort of 10 to 15% conservative, it's still substantially more conservative. So it would have more viewpoint diversity there. But yeah, there's that tool which we link to in the report, which allows you to sort of look at these schools by share of conservatives and Republicans and Democrats and so on. Um, but I think one of the broader points, which I think will come out in a subsequent report, is just how important the viewpoint diversity is. Right? We talk a lot about having Chicago principles and the right, free speech, academic freedom policies, and the importance of administrations. But arguably, they can only do so much. I mean, if your peers on social media and in class, and that's who you socialize with, and that they can make or break your experience at university, they have a lot of power over you. And so even if like at the University of Chicago, even if they're doing a really good job in terms of formal protections for academic freedom, you could still have a quite repressive atmosphere. And one of the things that I think is going to come out, well, I know will come out in that report, is just how important having a very high viewpoint diversity score is for having high openness in terms of discussions and freedom, intellectual freedom. And in fact, you need to have that if you're really going to be free to have discussions.
Well, this is the entire justification for diversity, for DEI, affirmative action. It's like you get different viewpoints, and then but like you can just select people on different viewpoints. You could just directly select in that rather than use race as a proxy. Especially if the people of the race are going to be the same the minority race are going to be of the same politics as the majority of the student body. That really doesn't add anything. Yeah, so it seems to me there's like a missed opportunity here for conservatives to say, okay, you believe in diversity, like you should. I mean, it's easily manipulable, right? Anyone can just, if you just ask people, are you conservative or liberal, they can, check a box and say they're conservative if you gave affirmative action to conservatives. But you can look at like extracurriculars and stuff like that. Did you remember that the one data where conservative extracurriculars actually hurt you? I think this was like Princeton. Somebody got a hell of the data. This was a while ago. This might have been 10 or 15 years ago now. But they had
Yeah.
like people who had things that were sort of coded as conservative, like Future Farmers of America or something like that. Something like that. They were hurt in college admissions. Controlling for SAT scores and GPA and all that. So yeah, it seems to be
Yeah.
like they're just on the DEI, their own affirmative action people, on their own terms. There's a case for affirmative action for conservatives.
Well, this is really interesting because in the context of the Harvard, affirmative action case, right? That if the rationale for affirmative action is diversity, this is actually a case where diversity really can be demonstrated to have a positive effect, and you can measure it and prove it in the data. But the only problem is it's political diversity and it's not demographic diversity. But this kind of shows that actually what these universities have been doing is focusing solely on race and gender, or race essentially as diversity. But it kind of shows they're clearly not very interested in political or other kinds of diversity, because they've actively sought to reduce political diversity through forms of political discrimination, such as diversity statements, essentially political litmus tests for jobs, uh, signaling in terms of political causes that universities support, so creating a hostile environment for conservatives. So all of these actions that universities have taken are in the direction of creating conformity around a set of progressive political values and driving out the political diversity. So yeah, and what's interesting is that when you poll on these questions, uh, you actually find that there's pretty good bipartisan support for paying as much or more attention to political diversity as race and gender diversity in various types of hiring, for example, or various types of membership. So actually, there's a lot of support for giving as much attention to political diversity as to these other forms of diversity. Do I think universities will do it? No. But I think if they were consistent, if they truly believed in diversity, they would.
Why don't you here's an idea. Why don't you write an amicus brief to submit to the Supreme Court in the Harvard case that's before them right now, and make this point, because there's not a lot that people can say that it's new on this topic, but this is sort of new. People can look at, oh, you're discriminating against Asians, like, yeah, people have done that data, but this, I think, is something that's worth sort of pushing, that you can't really take this stuff at face value, because obviously they don't have affirmative action for people with the different ideas. All they care about is race, and they couldn't care less about viewpoint diversity, which they say they care about. So this is like
Yeah.
this is a way to sort of win the argument.
Yeah, well, you're giving you don't give me some dangerous ideas here, Richard. But I've never done a brief before. But yeah, I think in a way it gives the lie to this idea that this is about that what they care about is diversity of thought, right? I think that because it's very very difficult to show that those demographic forms of diversity are produced. I mean, I'm obviously interested in measurable outcomes, but to say that that produces a more diverse intellectual atmosphere or a substantially more diverse atmosphere, I think is tricky to prove empirically. I'd be interested in studies that have tried to do that, but I haven't seen any. Whereas in this case, yeah, I mean, it's very clear that greater political diversity results in less self censorship. So I think that is a very obvious. But I think, but as you say, of course, it does sort of show that the interest in diversity, full stop, is just not there in terms of these universities.
Yeah. So when you wrote this report, I think it's supposed to be somewhat of a guide for for maybe parents or people deciding which college to go to. Is that right? It's trying to help them
Yeah,
sort of understand the environment that they'll be stepping into.
I think that's right. I think it is just a way of sort of seeing, okay, well, this is what the student body looks like in this university versus that. Um, it's any parents who may not realize what those liberal arts colleges student bodies are really like. It's worth them consulting before they send their kid to Wellesley if they're some kind of a conservative. But yeah, I think that's it's not going to make a huge difference because a lot of people go in state, but just a tool that people can look at, just maybe to inform a decision they were probably going to make anyway.
Yeah. I mean, me personally, I think I would rather, if I wanted to have intellectually stimulating conversation, I mean, I would I think I would choose a very liberal school that had a higher SAT score than a lower school of, I think a lot of these people at these state schools that call themselves conservatives, that means, tailgating and getting drunk and going to the football game and cheering. I don't know if that means that you're going to get the best intellectual experience of your life. While, if you have an intelligent kid who's interested in ideas, it still might be better to go into the liberal space if your other option is, somewhere that's less intellectual overall.
Yeah, I guess it depends what you're after. I mean, if you want to have open conversations, if you don't want to have, if you think the political discrimination and bias is going to suffocate you in the sense will prevent you from reaching your full potential, then you shouldn't go to those schools. If you think that, okay, I can, maybe I will by having arguments with people, spread my wings and sharpen my wits, then yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things in the Ivy League is if you look at the conservative students there, like if you take conservative students in the conservative colleges, let's say in the mountain or southern states, very high shares say they have the same political views as their parents. Uh, Whereas the conservatives in the Ivy League, a much higher share of them seem to say they've got a different view than their parents. So maybe there's more of your kind of independent thinking conservative type that's in the Ivy. I mean, amongst that small 10 to 15% conservative in the Ivies, you probably do have some very interesting people there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it depends on what you want to do with your life. I mean, if even if you want to go into politics, I mean, you're going to be better off if you even a conservative politics, you're probably better off signaling that you went to a good school.
Yeah.
It's and then like, oh, my opinion, I don't know, like, I don't enjoy, people who aren't, that's smart. I don't want to have a conversation with them about politics anyway. I mean, it's often like, like it's like, their background and their intelligence and their, the amount that they pay attention to things and their reading just might not be up there. And it's like, oh, they're diverse in their ideology, but none of them know anything. I don't know if that's, the best environment to talk to people.
Well, maybe we're too pointy headed. I mean, I also went to a kind of, as you did, more liberal school. But I think, yeah, that's right. You've got to balance out a whole range of considerations. But if it is, I think, a consideration. I mean, if you're going, especially if you're going to be facing severe political discrimination, which could affect you in a whole range of walks of life. I mean, dating, partying. Who's going to come into a house with you. I think that could be an issue in the more extreme left leaning schools, right? So I think it all depends what your aim is. If you just want to have intellectual combat, yeah, maybe just head into the hornet's nest and I don't know. My experiences have all been good at. I had a year in Harvard, and they've all been. Partly, of course, you have different types of environments in these universities. You can select into the more sane ones, even if they are left of center. They're not aggressively intolerant left of center. So I think if you're able to do that, then you're probably okay. And then if you have your networks that are allow you to express yourself, then fine.
Yeah, and I think that for the dating thing is interesting. I don't think it's as much, oh, like people are gonna say you're a Trump supporter, I don't want to date you. I mean, that happens, but I don't think, like, people can say whatever they want in a poll. I think when people meet people in the flesh, I mean, I think that it's yeah, I think what women say they want in polls, or what they'll, or what men say, like what they do. I think there's just not much of a connection there. But I think what I would take the politics, if I had, college age kids, I think what I would, or I was thinking about going to college now, I think I would take the politics as sort of a proxy for, like, okay, you want to form you want to eventually get married, form a stable heterosexual relationship. Like, let's say that's what you want. The percentage Republican or percentage conservative is probably a good proxy for, like, percentage of people who are looking for something like that. While a liberal school is probably, if you just want to, just sow your wild oats for 4 years, maybe a liberal school is, not that people don't do that at conservative schools, but I think the conservative schools probably more conducive to forming long-term, monogamous traditional kind of relationships. So that's
I'm
the
trying
way
to
I would look at the data.
I'm trying to imagine sort of Oberlin or Wellesley as a party school, and I'm struggling. But
Yeah.
no.
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah, you're right. They're not party schools, right? I guess if you want. Yeah, if you want, I wonder. You know what? I wish the fire data had. I wish they had a percentage for. I wish they asked about number of sexual partners. I think that would be interesting. I would love to see Oberlin versus University of Alabama. I would love. I would love to see the difference. I would love to see the difference between males and females and getting into all of that in the politics. Yeah, unfortunately,
Yeah. Well. I'll talk to them, but I'm not sure I'm going to get a positive answer.
that's for a future. Okay, well, there's an opening. There's research they won't do, so maybe that opens up something for us.
Yeah.
Uh, Okay, cool. So yeah, so this is all interesting. We'll post the links. Is there any? What are you working on now, Eric? What's next for you?
Well, yeah, I've got some think tank reports that are one in Britain with Policy Exchange and one in with Manhattan Institute that are mainly looking at this issue of critical race theory, critical social justice. How widely is it being taught in schools? So we're surveying 18 to 20-year-olds about their school experiences. So that expect that to be out. Well, the British one will be out probably in a week or so, and then the U.S. one maybe in a few weeks. So, or at least a preliminary from the U.S. will be out in a few weeks on that. So, watch this space.
Great. Yeah. So today we're recording this on October 11th. So this will be either released or about to be released, probably by the time most people are listening to this. Okay. Great. Well, Eric, it's been great having you on, and yeah, until next time.
Great, Richard. Thanks a lot.